All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's having a good virtual conference so far here with TriAgile. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm glad I was able to still make it virtually. I'm going to talk a little bit about enriching management. One of the things that I found is that when I, as a coach, or maybe you, if you're a Scrum Master, or perhaps you're a manager, you find that when people pepper you with servant leadership and say, I want you to be a servant leader, and that's about as far as they go, it becomes a little frustrating. So I'm going to try to help you get past that frustration and understand why that may be occurring if you happen to be in any one of those roles. So this is the agenda I planned on going through. We'll make sure we understand sort of where I'm coming from servant leadership. We're going to talk a little bit about, with an exercise, some specific frustrations that you've perhaps seen. Then we'll talk a tiny bit about why managers are resisting servant leadership and why they come from that background, of that approach of thinking that they need to resist that. Then we'll get into how you can enrich management, which will get at what we want servant leaders to do, but it will take a different tack. And then we'll get into some specifics about delegation. I'll again give you a little exercise that you can practice something with, and then we'll move into an exercise at the end about how we can move from those frustrating tasks that we were being told to do or things not to do into things that maybe you can do. At the end, I have a Slack channel 201 set up on the TriAgile system. I will begin monitoring that for anybody posting there. So if you have questions or anything that we didn't get to address in the session itself, you feel free to drop in there. I'll be monitoring there. We can have further conversations there. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about what a servant leader is. This is the definition that Robert Greenleaf came with. He's kind of considered the father of the description of servant leadership. He has a servant leader nonprofit that he founded, and that work continues to this day going on. The interesting thing you'll notice in this definition is it says that a servant leader approaches with the natural feeling of serving first. And what I found, throughout my experience is that most leaders have not done that. They come from the leader first position. I'm going to lead first. And then we come along as coaches or maybe Scrum Masters and we say, hey, we need you to be a servant leader. We want you to serve first. So with that, now that we have a sort of a definition, what I'd like to do is jump into an exercise. So you'll need a piece of paper and a pen. And what I'd like you to do is simply record some of the tasks that if you are a manager, you've been told to do these tasks or not do these tasks to be a good servant leader. Or I'd like you to also record down if you're a coach or you're a Scrum Master or somebody else that witnesses what's going on with managers, maybe what they're being told by coaches or Scrum Masters, what these managers are being told to do from a task perspective in order to serve their teams. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to do this exercise. Okay, that's time. So let's move on and look at a debrief here. So in your chat session, if you want to share one or two key frustrations, and remember we're talking about the actual tasks that you're being told or told not to do, either told to do or not to do, or the ones that you see being coached at the people. If you would just post those, let's see if any particular themes emerge. So just post them into the chat window.
So it looks like we're starting to get a few in, Paul.
Yep. Yep. See a couple dealing with tracking, and then another one saying just totally just trust the team, told not to do any of the team's work for them. Not sure what P/F is, but it looks like maybe testing results out of QA. Oh, pass fail. Thank you. Appreciate that. So becoming sort of the voice for teams. Yeah. So telling team members to be transparent, but then coming down on them and updating tickets. And a bunch of extra extraneous stuff. Career conversations without much guidance. So that's All right, it looks like it's slowing down a little bit, so we'll move on. So we've got some themes around communication, and perhaps being a go-between, and also being like an extra tracker to perhaps the managers above them. So that's what sort of the themes we're pulling out. Well, let's talk a little bit about why that might happen. So Charles Duhigg wrote a great book called The Power of Habit. Highly recommend you reading it if you haven't. And he talks about people get cues, and then they start making decisions, or they start taking actions. And then that becomes some form of identity. So when we're looking at a cue that a manager might have, they might get reminded that they've been assigned as a manager. That has a whole bunch of expected actions that they're supposed to take, and they get reminded of that on a constant basis by their boss, or if you happen to be the top exec, probably by the board or the shareholders of things that you're responsible for. And then that starts establishing what goes into your identity as your manager or as an exec. And so this becomes a reinforcing thing, because now I've got this identity, and then I get reminded again, which then reinforces perhaps the same kind of tasks and stuff that I was being asked to do. And so you get this reinforcing loop, and eventually you sort of crave for that reward of having that management reinforcement. And then along comes Agile and the coaches that come along with it, and Scrum Masters. And we say, no, you need to change your identity as servant leader, and here's a whole bunch of tasks that you need to start doing, and oh, by the way, stop doing a bunch of other ones. And so what happens is we're trying to create new habit loops that are competing with the old habit loops. Charles Duhigg would tell you, don't try to change the reward, only try to change the tasks. So that's really what this whole approach that I'm talking about is trying to do. We don't want to be trying to actually change the identity and change the task. We just want to change the task, and we also want to change the language that we're using a bit. So we want to take a look at these as just other types of management tasks. They're just a little different. And we want to make sure that the person still knows that they are a manager and that they have responsibilities as managers to do certain things. So we don't eliminate their identity. We just want to create a new craving for some of the new tasks to do. So let's talk a little bit about what some of these might look like. So here are some of the new tasks I would say are particularly relevant and actually sort of align very well with what servant leadership would be about. So designing jobs, and I don't mean like sitting down and writing a position description or anything like that. I'm talking about actually sort of helping people understand how they can change the nature of their work to be better. And who is better than a manager that's probably going to be writing their performance evaluation on top of that? Also, observing the work system. Managers are in a great position to actually sort of observe the entire work system that's going on. As you observe work systems, you may see problems emerging that the team or teams have no awareness of whatsoever. So you can start solving those proactively. And then we want to also, when we talk about what teams are trying to solve, they're usually trying to either produce a product that solves a problem or takes care of a need of some kind. So we want to design good problem statements that teams can work to solve. And then the last thing we want to do, in order for them to be effective in this, we want to delineate good delegated authority. We want to delegate as much authority in the appropriate way that we can. And this is the way I look at how we can actually enrich management's job. And part of it's actually enriching the jobs of the people underneath of you. So that's where we'll start. So we're going to go into unlocking the motivation through job design. What's interesting about people's jobs is when we're talking knowledge work, most people are internally motivated. We always hear about this autonomy, mastery, and purpose from Daniel Pink as being sort of like the intrinsic motivation. And that knowledge about that intrinsic motivation has been around much longer than that. I'm going to reference some work by Hackman and Oldman that I think is a little bit more relevant to what we're trying to do. So over on the left, we want to basically unlock this internal work motivation that people have to get us to outcomes that we desire. In order to unlock that, we need to produce 3 critical psychological states. The people need to experience meaningfulness. They have to be able to attach themselves that their job actually has meaning. They need to experience some responsibility for the outcomes, not relying on other things or where I've been told exactly what you're going to do and how we're going to do it, and so all the decision-making authority has been taken away from me. And also, we're going to talk a little bit think about the knowledge of actual results. Can I see something actually being produced that's useful? And for somebody that's doing software engineering, it would be like, hey, my test just passed. Or the product owner told me this was great. Or I got feedback from a user that the user experience was really good. So when we look to the right, starting at the bottom, that relies on feedback from the job. If we don't have that feedback, we don't really know how well we're doing on the tasks that we've been asked to do. And this is also sort of how do we get to mastery. If we don't have any feedback, we really don't know how well we're doing. And of course, autonomy gets into exactly how we experience responsibility for our outcomes, but meaningfulness is a little bit different. So there's this idea of task significance. How important will this be to somebody else? That's the sort of the task significance that Oldman and Hackman talk about. And that's sort of equivalent to the purpose that's in Daniel Pink's work. But there's also two other things. The ability to identify with that task. Can I identify with the application I'm producing? Can I identify with the user story? I might be able to identify with the functional work that I'm trying to do, like I'm coding or I do testing or stuff like that, but then that reduces down the significance. I can't attribute the testing per se with the actual significance that it's trying to produce. So when you put those two together, that's why you want to have these pieces of work that actually have meaningful value. We talk a lot about cross-functional teams and growing people to be T-shaped, for example, and learning new skills. It's this actual ability to use other skills. So while I may be a Java developer, for example, being able to learn a little bit about how to write good user stories or splitting stories or understanding a bit about how we might do behavioral tests, for example, or maybe some of the system administration work that might be required when I pass work off, also how to do builds and automate those. Those are all different varieties of skills, and the more variety I have, the more interesting work I have. So that allows me to hold interest. It's not the same boring rut routine that I have. We're not ignoring that you might want to get very specialized, but we're trying to say that you want a little bit of variety. And if you take a look at what happens in people's real world, you want a little bit of variety when they go home. So the same thing is true in the workplace. Now, people don't work individually. They actually work in teams. So since they work in teams, we want to talk a little bit about the teamwork that they're going to have. So, but we take these job design features, that's just one component. There are two other components, the organizational context features and the interpersonal process features that kind of go into that. So let's talk a little bit about the organizational context. Three things kind of are part of the organizational context. The rewards and objectives we give for good performance. They could be formal rewards like, bonuses or raises or promotions, or they may be very informal, like I'm considered part of the group or not a part of the group. I might be included to be able to go to a conference or not go to a conference. Those are the kinds of rewards and objectives. We also have the availability of task-relevant training. How am I being able to get trained for the work that I'm going to have? And also consultation. For example, am I able to talk to a product owner that can help me define what a user story would look like so I know what to build? And then that leads into clarity of tasks and constraints. And so where managers can help out are observing for positive and negative effects that may be coming from rewards and objectives and trying to figure out better ways to make those look better, work better with the team to keep teamwork working together. We might want to make sure that the stakeholders are being appropriately involved so that consultation is occurring or that we're recognizing when training is needed. We also want to take a look at designing problems, making sure that things are scoped and for clarity, but allowing creativity, and also making sure that the people have the right delegated authority to make decisions around those. And you'll notice that those job design features all just roll in. So all 5 of those features that we're looking at, all of those roll into the work group factors. And you can see that each one of these rolls into a factor each, which then eventually roll into work group effectiveness. So that's the research around organizational context feature that Hackman and Oldman has. Now the next thing is looking at the interpersonal process features. So here we have 3 different things also that come in. So we have coordinating our efforts and fostering commitment. And so when we're talking, we have that occurring within teams, coordinating between people, but also if it's a larger effort, or if it's maybe has other groups that the team is dependent on, it's also going to be working between teams and fostering commitment to achieve objectives between teams. When we look at different scaling approaches, that's exactly what they're trying to do, is help coordinate and foster commitment amongst teams. We also want to make sure we're weighing input between the people and sharing knowledge between those people. And then lastly, we want to also make sure that we are either inventing or implementing appropriate strategies to get the right type of work done. And we can look and see that each one of those rolls it into one of the work group of factors. It might be like how much effort is being brought to bear, or the amount of knowledge is being brought to bear, or maybe the appropriateness for the selected strategies. So again, we look at where managers can help. Managers can help by looking for the space between teams, since we're the ones that can sort of see between teams. We can observe for language and habits that are occurring that might be reducing the input that we're getting from different people. And we can also look for problems and lack of authority that are occurring with the strategies that they're choosing and implementing. So let's look and see where these things help take us. So think of a manager as being able to see different trees. If I'm within a team and I'm a tree, I might only see the trees around me, and I can't see the other sets of clusters of trees that also surround my team. Whereas a manager is posed to be able to see not only the trees within a team, but also the space between the teams and what needs to occur. So that's the metaphor I would like you to think about. So what might you observe? Well, I like to look at it as a set of questions you're trying to think of. Like, what's working between teams? What's not working between teams? You notice I'm not asking specifically about what's going on in a team, although that might be useful. Teams can quite often figure that stuff out. They have a harder time figuring out what might not be working between teams. Also, we might want to take a look at what language is being used, or the relationships that are emerging, or whether there's even a gap in a relationship that's occurring in teams. What's happening with teams? Are there handoffs of inventory that's not producing any kind of value? Maybe that's something we can identify much more easily than the team themselves. They may not know. They may be producing something that a group has asked for, and they don't have any witness of the fact that it's not being used anywhere, that it's just sitting there in an empty space. And also, again, we can look for those habits that teams might be making and the decisions they might be doing that are habitual. And so as we look at that, we want to look for problems that may be emerging, especially those between teams or that are habitual in nature. So we want to help resolve those before they become real problems. We want to sort of emerge, as those things are looking like they emerge, we don't want them to become Godzilla on the shore. We want to kind of hold off Godzilla and keep them in the sea. So again, looking at the questions, we can kind of start seeing like what's not working between teams. We can listen in for negative language that's occurring, like us versus them, or what gaps are occurring in team relationships where we know they should be talking to one another. They're going to be deploying an application. They're not talking to security. Security might say no if they haven't talked to them. That might be something to help them get connected. Again, wasteful things that are being produced and habits that have negative consequences. Those are the things we can do. Now, we don't want to impose a bunch of solutions on that, so we want to make sure we involve those people, that the team that are doing the work, to make sure that they're conscious of this. And hopefully we can learn how to delegate and help them get familiar with what to look for themselves, so we don't become what Richard Sheridan was saying this morning, the hero of having to do all this work. We're actually training people to do what we can, therefore we're doing what any good manager would do, training their replacement. Which will help us move up and take on even higher positions of being able to look across. So the next thing we need to look at is how do we create alignment? Well, one of the ways I would say we do that is through good problem design. What goes into that? Well, obviously we want to get alignment on goals. We want to help teams know what the goals are. So either a team or several teams that are working on the same goal, we want to make sure that they understand what that is. And we also want to make sure that they have the minimum valuable set of constraints that they have. We don't want too many constraints, creativity, but then we also want to make sure that we have the right amount of constraints so that they're not going off the rails. We're looking to offer protection, but we want to allow for as much creativity. So I would say that one way to look at that is try to think about what you want teams to avoid, whether you're handing it to multiple teams or one team, and not what they can't do, right? So an example of that would be we would like to avoid losing money so we remain profitable, so there's a rationale, over don't exceed a certain amount of dollars, which, yes, that may help you achieve of not losing money, but the team now doesn't really have any creativity of how to avoid losing money. They might be able to figure out a trade-off of something that you couldn't have foreseen. Then we want to think about if we need measurements of progress along the way, we want to make sure they trace to the goal, but we also want to make sure that if we don't exactly understand how to measure that, let's consider an experiment to figure out, are we measuring the right things? Because that can become sort of that going back to that reward type system. If we start measuring the wrong things, we might start creating behavior we don't want to see. Then, as I mentioned before, we want to delegate authority. So we want to think about delineating delegated authority. So one way I like to think about doing that is using Jürgen Apello's delegation poker. I find this a really useful way for describing. I know when I joined the Navy, it was pretty much you could delegate authority to people that worked for you, or you told them what to do. So you either got the 1 or the 7 on this spectrum. Whereas Jürgen would tell you, well, you can tell them what to do. You might figure out what you want to do and then sell them on it. Or perhaps you want to consult with them, but you're still going to make the decision. Maybe you'll jointly agree on it. Or perhaps you're going to let them make the decision and just give them advice. Or perhaps you just want to be told what their decision is. Or lastly, you fully delegate it. You don't even care what the decision is. Any one of those are a valid way of looking at it. So this brings us to our next exercise. Here's a little scenario for you, and I want you to try to select the level that you personally would be comfortable with for this scenario. And if you happen to be able to do that very quickly, then you can also, and if it's anything above sell, because sell or tell are pretty much you making the decision entirely without even consulting them, think about any constraints that you might want to have if you get that done really quickly. So again, you are a manager of a software team that's going to be building a brand new mission-critical application. The team needs to figure out what their development infrastructure will look like and what their target software architecture will look like. So what level of delegation are you comfortable with? So just record down the number. I'd like you to go ahead and at the end, when we go to do the debrief, you're going to be posting that in chat. So we won't be posting your extra credit question when you get the chat, but just I'd like you, if you have a chance to do that, go ahead and do it. And I'll give you a couple of minutes. Okay. If you go ahead and start posting what you thought for your thing, I see that Chris Wells already has. So we have an agree, we'd work together. We have a 6 where we'd inquire what they came up with. Let them make the decision. 4 where we jointly agree on it. 5, we give them some advice. Okay, I like that. And yep, it's kind of like reverse selling. A 6 is what that is. Yep. 5, 4. Cool. All right. Thank you for those extra bits of information there, Rob. That's very useful. Yep. So there are some definite constraints, and you could, break this down. Like maybe, maybe I'll set the budget and tell them what the budget is. Maybe it's a 5 on advising them on what, the software architecture might look like. Maybe a 4 around some compliance stuff. Could be a few things around that, so you could technically break this down. Yep. All right, looks like we're slowing down a little bit, so what I'd like to move on to next is just taking a look at what might you do with this. So once you've kind of played out some scenarios that you would want teams, so this is a great way of looking at it. So create a radiator. Create a big information radiator, and this is not only for the team, but it's for you as well. This is what I agreed on with the team around where they get to make decisions and the level of decision-making they have, and they can see that as well so they don't overstep their authority. You can create what's called a delegation board, and this is an example that was on a post from Jürgen Apello. And essentially you can see nowhere in this particular example that he had about vacation days or team membership or anything did the agreement with the team come along and say, yeah, they get to fully do everything and I don't have any say. But there were places where I at least want to know, like tool selection. If they want to change over to a different software tool, then yeah, they can make that decision. I just need to know about it, perhaps because I've got to pay for it or not, and those are the kinds of things. But goal setting was something I would sell them on if in Jurgen's shoes. So again, those are things that you could take a look at. And I love this particular way of looking at it and creating this as an information radiator because it becomes a reminder to everyone. All right, so now that we've talked through all of this stuff, let's pull aside your little list of frustrations. And now what I would like you to do is in the categories that we were talking about of designing jobs and trying to help jobs be more unlocked for intrinsic motivation, observing the work system, which would get into looking into the things and being curious, proactively resolving issues and designing problems. I'd like you to think about what behaviors or tasks might you do differently that you would choose that would help you be a better servant leader, or if you were a coach, how you advise somebody to be a better servant leader now that we have these new language of ways of looking at things. So again, focus on tasks that would replace the tasks that you had that were frustrating you. See how many options you can come up with those as well. And then try to pick one that excites you. I'll give you 3 minutes to do this. Okay, go ahead and start posting these in the chat. I see that Chris Wells already has. If you would put an asterisk by the idea that really excites you as well. And then I just want you to contemplate, how well this is handling the frustrations that you were feeling earlier, particularly if you happen to be executive or a manager. Or perhaps, if you've gotten some new insights, think about, if you're a coach or a Scrum Master, maybe how you might approach things a little bit differently. So we'll do about 5 minutes to get some posts here and see what we get. Oh, I like that, George. Collaborate with a team designing a means of internal tracking that fits them. Yeah. Let's see what other ones we get here. Yeah, so keeping people informed. You don't have to tell them, anything more than being reflective of when a due date is actually there. Yeah, and amplifying what other team members are doing and so other team members can learn from them. That's great, especially if you happen to go across teams, right? That's something that we do at Excella. We actually have a approach where we try to cull what's going really well in our teams to then help other teams understand what's going really well. So thank you, Scott, for sharing that. I think one thing I'd like to amplify what Scott said there is that you're taking stuff that's in the same context of the organization, helping team members, one team learn from other team members. Yeah, again, here we got another great cross-pollination where we're bringing people from other areas together, right? Helping people understand progress without having to do status reports. That's probably the best thing I like about that particular approach, of letting knowledge be shared on the progress. In the last minute, do we have any other ones that might come out? Just make sure we have a little bit of time to capture any other thoughts that people might have. Right, so this is a great way of showing an alignment on goals and designing a problem. So here's a solution we want to give as opposed to just deliver this code. Helps promote the task significance that we were talking about on the individual job as well as designing a problem. That way, if the team sees, oh, here's a piece of software, rather than us writing something, but we can glue these two things together, it allows them to be better aligned with what might be a better solution. Also giving them a better, talking about corporate-wide initiatives and giving them broader scope in what the company is trying to achieve. These are great. Cool. One more little exercise for yourselves. I'd like you to take a minute and just write down something different that you might do following this session. And I just want, at this time, I also want to remind you that if we don't get to, we're going to have some time for some Q&A here in the chat thing, but I'll be monitoring Slack channel 201, so if you have other questions that you want to drop by and ask, feel free. So go ahead and take a minute and write down something you might do different after this session. And there's not going to be a need to share this. Okay, just want to let you know this will be in the slide deck, so when you go to pick it up, these are the books that you might find helpful that I'm sort of referencing throughout that I've built this stuff, because I find that, having data and stuff out there is awesome, but you sort of need to have a working theory and then seeing if the data supports the theories that you're working under. With that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'll open up the chat session to Q&A if anybody wants to ask questions or not. It looks like we've got about 7 minutes or so before we should be done, and so feel free to ask a question, and I'll see if I can answer it. Yeah, so I think from BWM 23, so best approach to instilling, again, this is where I would look at changing language. Rather than saying servant leadership, if you have some coaching, or if you happen to be a Scrum Master trying to coach upward a little bit, or if you happen to be a boss, for example, and you have a manager that's having difficulty with the servant leadership mindset change, rather than doing that, maybe talk a little bit about these type of aspects, like how could you go out and help people understand how to do good job design to promote that creation of cross-functional skills, or how can you as a manager look across and look for the things that are not working between teams. Where are we having extraneous handoffs we don't need? I think that would be the way I would approach that. You are effectively having them become a servant leader without saying thou shalt become a servant leader. That's sort of like the whole thing here. You're trying to create a new habit. So that would be sort of my answer for that one. For David, let me see what he's saying. So the reference that's pulled on the critical psychological states comes from the Hackman and Oldman book. That particular one, I'll just pop that reference up. That's the work design. Actually, I think it might be really called work redesign. Might have mistyped that. But it's actually from 1980, which is amazing to me that hasn't gotten as much attention. So I think you'd find that very helpful. Not to say that Daniel Pink's book is not helpful, but his is basically a little bit more storytelling, culled from a lot of research, and he doesn't really go deep into some of the research all that much, whereas Hackman and Oldman will give you this model that you can think about. And I think that, I find myself, I like to have a model in my head, and then I look for data and stuff that's either supporting or where it's showing that things are not working very well. Looks like we have about 4 minutes left for any questions. And again, I will go to the Monitoring Slack 201 channel. So if you have any other questions that come up later after you ponder on this. So again, with a couple of minutes remaining, I just again want to thank you very much for attending my session. I hope you found it helpful. I've got a question I'll answer. Those are ways you can get in touch with me. Twitter. If you want to call my cell, I would recommend you text me first. I do get some annoying things that come across cell, but if you text me and say you're in my session, I'd greatly appreciate that, and I'll definitely talk to you. My email address, or that's my blog, personal blog, if you want to drop something there. A team relationship gap. Yeah, so I work a lot with government clients, and a lot of times the contract teams that I work with don't understand who they need to work with. From other stakeholders. Yeah, they usually figure out, I've got to work with security, but there may be other stakeholders that they might have to deal with. So as a manager, this is one of the things that I can help them understand when they're being onboarded. Try to help them understand, hey, you really need to set up some inter-team working agreements with this particular stakeholder group. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble later when you try to deploy, or they might, be able to put up the hand and say, no, you're not going to be able to go forward, or anything like that. So security is like an obvious one, but there are other compliance wickets that government people have to deal with a lot. It could also be how things are funded, for example. Maybe it's if I'm looking down as a higher level manager, it might be that the manager below doesn't know they need to go make the connection with certain people to help develop their budget more effectively, right? They may just be trying to do it entirely on their own without getting input from the other stakeholders that they may need. Does that help answer the question? By the way, a little divergent, if you're familiar with A3 reporting, and if not, you might want to take a look at a book called A3 Thinking. That's a great way of kind of getting these connections to start occurring, because it comes from the Toyota production system. A higher level manager has to sign off on whatever A3 report is being generated, but it's not for a compliance check or approval. It's to make sure the person talked to all the right stakeholders. So that's a great way, if somebody's got a proposal for improvement or to get rid of a problem, to make sure they're talking to all the right people. And that's what they do on the factory floor in the Toyota production system. It's really kind of cool, and it helps make those connections. So that would be a nuance I would throw in if you're not familiar with it.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Any final questions before we close this session? And while we're waiting for those responses, feel free to go to Sketch to provide feedback on Paul's session.
Yeah, please do.
Well, thank you, Paul. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, folks.